All right, well, welcome everyone to the ASAP member webinar. My name is Sasha Peterson. I'm the Managing Director of the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, and we have the pleasure today having Christian Baja, who works for the City of Baltimore, and the city was selected as the 2015 Prize for Progress winner. So we have an exclusive opportunity to get her insights on the work that they're doing in climate adaptation and resilience, and how what went into the efforts that they put in that were selected as the winner for this year's Prize for Progress. Just a brief agenda for today, so I'll give this welcome and introduction, then Kristen will provide the webinar. We'll have time for discussion after the webinar, and then we're going to shift to a new concept, the ASAP Innovation Room. So we're going to, if you can, stay on the line a little bit after the body of the webinar to kind of talk about some of the key challenges and opportunities revolving around the approach that the City of Baltimore used, and we'll do a little bit of conversation over the web or through the phone here, and then we'll transition that to an online discussion. So we'll talk more about that later, but if you can stay with us for that, it would be great. As you know, you're all members of the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. We have about 1,000 members now from around the country and really focus on connecting and supporting the people who are building climate resilience. We're supported by the Institute for Sustainable Communities, the Kresge Foundation, and the MacArthur Foundation, but we're also supported by members like you who are joining us. So please keep in mind that at the end of the month, we'll be transitioning to include some member dues as part of your membership, so please don't hesitate to upgrade and join us for that conversation. So just a little background on the Prize for Progress in Adaptation. The prize itself was awarded at the National Adaptation Forum in May this year, and the selection committee reviewed almost 30 applications. There was a subset that were selected as finalists. We had 4 finalists that represented a broad cross-section of adaptation efforts that were happening across the country, from natural resource management to more urban-focused initiatives, and it was the unanimous choice of the selection committee that the City of Baltimore received this year's award, and it's due in no small part to the efforts of Kristen. She is the Climate and Resilience Planner with the Office of Sustainability at the Baltimore City. She's currently responsible for developing and implementing what she'll be talking about today, the city's Disaster Preparedness Project and Plan, or DP3, and which is innovative in that it integrates climate adaptation with hazard mitigation efforts. She is also responsible for climate change communication and outreach, the community rating system certification for the city, floodplain management, resilience planning, and the STAR Communities certification. So on top of that, she's an active member of the Climate Communications Consortium of Maryland, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, and the Baltimore City Forestry Board. Before joining the City of Baltimore, she worked for the City of Ann Arbor, developing their Climate Action Plan and Sustainability Framework. She has a Master's in Urban Planning and a Master's of Science from the University of Michigan, and she's an avid cyclist and loves exploring the city by bike. So on top of all that, she is our guest speaker for this webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to transition over to Kristen.
I think you need to give me control so you can show my screen.
All right, I'm passing that over to you.
All right, can you see the, let me know when you can see the first page.
I can see it.
All right, great. All right, well, thank you so much, Sasha, and thank you all for attending today. Appreciate you all being here. Just to quickly show you what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to go into a little bit of background on Baltimore, just in case y'all don't know much about the city, some recent events we've had and why we decided to move forward with this process, going a little bit into our plan development, and then some of the work we've done around implementation since adopting our plan. From there, some of the work we're doing around communication, and then how we're integrating climate adaptation into other work here in the city. So just in case you don't know where Baltimore is, we're right there next to D.C., up at the top of the Chesapeake Bay, just south of Philadelphia and just northeast of D.C. We are the most heavily developed area in Maryland, so we have the large port, and obviously that and the waterfront are hugely important assets to us. We're also called a city of neighborhoods. We have over 256 distinct neighborhoods here, which leads to a lot of interesting planning and work around implementation, because each neighborhood obviously has its own identity and stakeholders. So we are at the base of 4 watersheds, the Jones Falls, Gwynns Falls, Back River, and direct Baltimore Harbor watershed. So everything I'm going to show you with what we're dealing with water is obviously incredibly important. We're also at the top of the Chesapeake Bay there, so you can see we're getting water that's coming down from the watersheds and also up through the Chesapeake Bay. So we're dealing with water kind of in both directions. So some of the recent events and the reason that we started to be considering climate adaptation and integrating climate adaptation into our planning processes, this is maybe an image you've seen before from last year in April, where we had the 26th Street landslide. And those are just some pretty big non-tidal flooding events that we've had over the last 5 years. There's some images of our Monument Street sinkhole that continues to open up no matter how much our Transportation Department and Public Works Department puts in good efforts to keep it closed. That bridge there is actually about 5 hours later had water all the way up to the base of the sign, and then there's a large amount of debris that we have coming from these events as well. We also have, unfortunately, some poor judgment that comes during these events where people see water and they try to drive through it. So that's the image on the left, and then on the right there, it's the image of the CSX rail line partners who decided to clear off the rail line and throw all the debris onto the city side for us to clean up after the 26th Street landslide there. We're also dealing a lot with tidal flooding, and this has been something that we're expecting to see increase. These are images of Hurricane Isabel in 2003 and a lot of the tidal flooding that we have along the inner harbor. But from the Union of Concerned Scientists report in 2014, Baltimore is expected to go from 17 tidal flooding events per year to 227 tidal flooding events per year. So that's a really big issue for us, especially where a lot of our old historic buildings and historic neighborhoods are located, as well as a lot of the economy of the city that keeps us going. Obviously, with that, storm surge and sea level rise are both big issues. I think that most coastal cities along the East Coast are dealing with these same projections. But for us, we had the storm surge of about 7.5 feet with Hurricane Isabel in 2003. We did some modeling with DC to see what Sandy would have looked like for us, and it would have been nearly 3 times as much. So these are big issues, and the storm surge is something that we're really focusing on. There's also been, substantial increase in hurricane activity in the Atlantic since the 1970s, so that's really something that we're looking at. Our recent tropical storms and hurricanes have been big issues, obviously not so much in the last couple of years, but for many of the years before that. So these are a lot of the reasons we've been starting to think about things, and this is just an image of Isabel and what it looked like downtown. That's not a river to the right. That's actually one of our main roads and main arteries between downtown and Federal Hill. So these are some of the events that kind of led to us moving forward. We're obviously going to also see big changes in heavy precipitation. We've already started seeing that. In 2012, we had the Snowmageddon that you can see on the bottom right-hand corner, which people in Baltimore close offices for an inch of snow. So if you can imagine getting several feet, it was quite an impact here. And then besides precipitation and water, we're really also looking at extreme heat. This is a big issue for us. It's been incredibly hot here the last few days, and we have issues every summer with extreme heat events and prolonged heat events. So that's a #1 issue for us right now. As well as extreme wind. We've been getting a lot more of these extreme wind storms, and I know a lot of you know about the derecho that happened during one of our highest heat waves. That actually knocked out power for several weeks for people, and so that is a huge issue for us as well. So I wanted to just give a quick review of the hazards that we've been facing and why we've decided to kind of move forward with this planning process, and just show that everything really is becoming more severe and more intense and is quickly becoming something we need to consider in all that we're doing. So that moves on to the planning process and what we've decided to do with planning. Hazard mitigation is obviously an action taken to reduce or eliminate long-term risks, and FEMA does require an all-hazard mitigation plan for cities to be eligible for pre-disaster mitigation funds. What we decided to do was take our hazard mitigation plan requirement and incorporate this idea of climate adaptation by taking action now and bringing those two planning processes together. So the idea of looking at our current historical hazards with the all-hazard mitigation plan, but also adapting to new and predicted climate conditions and bringing those two pieces together. So we used three different sort of methodologies for this. FEMA requires us with the all-hazard mitigation plan to follow a certain structure. We also looked a lot at what ICLEI did with climate adaptation plans, and you have to remember this was a few years ago, so there were not as many toolkits or tools available at the time looking at methodology for how to create one of these plans. We also looked at some of the work we had done with our climate action plan, that's what CAP stands for, and kind of brought all of those together to find the sweet spot for us as far as planning and putting this plan together. The process kind of followed a structure of a risk assessment, so doing a full hazard identification and reviewing our historical impacts, doing a full vulnerability assessment and kind of looking at the economic, social, legal, and environmental consequences, and then going through a lot of our modeling and projected climate conditions to identify where we had weaknesses. And then there was a, vision, goals, strategies, all the other things that go along with planning put together as part of this process. One of the biggest things and one of the pieces I would highly recommend if anybody's attempting to do this kind of process is to really think about the structure of the plan. All hazard mitigation plans are typically structured by hazard, and we did do that for our hazard assessment. However, as far as our recommendations and our actions, we wanted to structure them in a way that made more sense to the city. So instead of structuring it by sea level rise, we wanted to use these four main categories of infrastructure, buildings, natural systems, and public services so that we could not only bring in experts in those areas to help us, with the risk assessment, but also to help us identify what we were going to do moving forward and give them ownership over those actions. So that this structure was incredibly helpful for us. We also had a very large advisory committee. So we had a 40-person advisory committee, and didn't even put all the people who were represented up on this slide. But it gives you an idea of all the different city departments and agencies we had involved, as well as external partners. And the only reason it was at 40 people is that's what we got capped at by the mayor's office. So instead of just relying on this advisory committee, we actually created a lot of subcommittees of special interest groups and experts that helped us go above and beyond in specific areas. And those were made up of folks along the, in the port, in the development community, in architectural community, and also with community groups. With an all-hazard mitigation plan, there are two required sort of town hall events. Well, we really felt that we wanted to get a lot more community input, and so we did hold the two large town halls and had people come and have the typical presentation. But then we also decided to really reach out into communities and neighborhoods and get feedback from people by going into their homes, to their churches, to anywhere that they felt comfortable, that they would invite us in, and instead of just doing a presentation, we really worked on having more of a dialogue, more of a conversation, asking them how they felt about a certain event that had happened, and then getting feedback from them on those impacts and how they thought it might get worse in the future. So it was a different sort of interaction. We really tried to do some innovation around that as well by providing free childcare, providing free food. Often if we were asking people to leave their neighborhood, we would provide them with free transportation, or we'd go to the places that they trust most and go directly to them. So these are some images of some of the trainings we've done. In the middle there, we actually brought computers to allow people to do some of the modeling in their house, and then we had these other events where they could come and get additional information. And then there was really the focus on modeling and what we were going to do with modeling and kind of bringing in new scenarios. I will say that our plan was stronger in modeling around sea level rise and some of the heat data, a little less with precipitation, but this is an image right here of our HAZUS MH assessment and what we looked at with our 500-year storm plus multiple levels of sea level rise. So this is a picture of the cover of the Disaster Preparedness Project and Plan, which was adopted in 2013. And this is kind of what the structure inside looks, with the main subcategory at the top, the strategies and actions with each of those, and then kind of what we're doing with implementation. We had 6 major goals. I'm not going to read them to you now, but these are major goals from the plan, and they can be found directly on our website as well. And the structure really followed that all hazard mitigation plan structure with the hazard identification and risk and vulnerability assessment. But then when we got into chapter 5 and 6 is where we switched up the structure and went more into those 4 main categories and how we wanted to move forward with implementation. We also had some additional considerations in our planning process. We are a community with a lot of historical and cultural assets, so we tried to do an initial brush of historic buildings and areas that we would need to do a deeper dive into. We looked at some engineering studies on critical facilities around the waterfront. We worked with the health department to integrate a health impact assessment as part of the process. And then we also worked a lot with the Office of Emergency Management to consider the connection between planning and response and recovery. And I think I mentioned before a lot of consideration around the port and the port as a partner. So that kind of moves us into implementation. We really started moving forward on implementation right away after the adoption of the plan in October of 2013. One of the first things we did was really to develop a crosswalk with all of our existing plans in the city that was quite a process, actually. And so we took all of the 231 actions in the DP3 and showed where they had co-benefits with these other plans and projects. What that also allowed us to do is identify connections within the plan. So we identified connections with emergency support functions. We would better connect with the Office of Emergency Management, and we also identified the areas where the Climate Action Plan overlaps heavily with identified actions so that we could take advantage of the co-benefits between climate mitigation and climate adaptation. We also looked a lot at our state and federal plans and had state and federal representatives on our advisory committee so that we were able to identify those overlaps as we were going through the planning process, and then we were able to gain support from them in implementation. I would say the biggest piece of prioritization and what we've really done moving forward is that idea of the overlap between climate mitigation and then our DP3 plan and areas that we felt we would get the most bang for our buck moving forward. And so those really popped up to the top in these main categories, such as building codes, energy grid, drinking water, and renewable energy. So one of the biggest things we started with is actually floodplain regulation. And I became a certified floodplain manager sort of by accident throughout this process to get to know more and more about the floodplain, and we were updating our floodplain code. And some of the biggest things that we've done are increase our flood protection elevation and increase our freeboard. So freeboard is that factor of safety. A lot of cities have a 1-foot freeboard. We moved up to a 2-foot freeboard. And then we also created specific areas in the city that would be regulated more heavily. So along our tidal floodplain, we actually have what's called the flood resilience area. And that is where we regulate both the 100 and 500-year floodplain, but we also regulate to the height of whichever is higher between the 500-year still water elevation and the 100-year BFEs, or base flood elevation. So that's a pretty big change in our code and has really created a lot of work with developers looking at the buildings along the waterfront moving forward. We also looked at a lot of, with the modeling, that most of these areas, like I mentioned before, downtown, we have a lot of historic districts that are completely underwater. So we've had to consider a lot of what we're doing with historic buildings and how we're going to maintain the historic integrity of those buildings while also making sure that we're keeping people and property safe. One of those things that we're working on is a flood design manual. Something similar in New York City has actually worked on one of these post-Sandy, but we're working on one specifically for our building typologies here in the city, looking a lot more at row houses and bigger existing historical structures, and then considering some of our critical systems. We're also doing assessments of some of our areas that are downtown, like I mentioned, Fells Point before. That is one of our historical communities, a lot of old row houses with old basements. This area floods quite often, and so trying to consider different options because, you know, people are not going to be leaving this neighborhood. This is a place they want to live with access to the water. So trying to consider options for potentially decorative benches that double up as flood walls or other systems that we'd have to put in place to protect people and property. And then another thing that connects really to the floodplain is we've decided to move forward. One of our big 6 goals in the plan was to become a community rating system community, and that's a voluntary incentive program through the National Flood Insurance Program where we get, it's sort of like the lead of flood insurance where you get points for doing more around floodplain management. And so we're really working on that now, and we'll have submitted our application next month to hopefully reduce flood insurance rates for people here in the city, but also to incentivize our political leaders to move forward on more floodplain management and stormwater management so that that continues to reduce people's insurance rates. We're also doing a lot of work with Department of Public Works and with a lot of our external partners around stream restoration, impervious surface removal, and some of Blue Alley projects. And these have been pretty big recently in kind of doing it with our MS4 permits and what's required with our TMDLs. And so we're looking at replacing and upgrading pipes, but also focusing on those areas in the outer watersheds and removing as much impervious surface as we can to help reduce the amount of flow coming into the city from the county. Another big piece that we put into our application for ASAP was what we're doing with our whole block approach and really considering entire communities when we're going through with different city agencies and partners. Instead of just having one initiative go in and do something with a community, we're trying to marry all of our initiatives together and consider a lot of these different elements when we're working with community members. And that includes things like cool roofs and weatherization, energy education, but also looking at trees and greening, stormwater management. And what we've really started with is identifying neighborhoods that are most vulnerable to the impacts from climate change. In this heat has been a big issue, and wind. We're looking at areas that lose power a lot. And we've started a pilot project getting solar onto row houses in low-income areas. And this includes energy efficiency education and weatherization, as well as getting cool roofs put on. And it also has the job focusing upon it to get more of those more white or cool roofs and more solar on houses in areas that are most impacted. We've also been working with a lot of our external partners, so private partners. Domino Sugar has been a big partner of ours, and they just installed in this last year a large solar array onto their rooftop. The Inner Harbor Water Wheel was a big partnership, and it's actually a really visible partnership that you can see downtown. And this works for 2 things. One, it removes debris that's coming down the Jones Falls that we get from the county and the city. And then it also is a solar-powered array, which allows us to do a little bit more education and outreach. So that's also a good partnership. And then we're looking at a lot of our critical facilities. Right now, the Back River Wastewater Treatment Plant has been our main focus. We've been working with the Office of Energy to really get solar panels in there. So right now, there are 4,200 panels on 5 acres, and we're working on getting even more sited very soon. Our ASAP application was also and vacant buildings. And so what we're trying to do is see those more as assets and health issues and also economic development. And one of the big initiatives that's come out for 8 different community most wants and needs. And then urban agriculture, stormwater management. So we've got 7 projects that are actually moving through right now as we speak. These are just images of 4 of the proposals and what they're actually doing. So there's a real food flower factory that's going in. There's a green lawn that got proposed by the Bridgeview community, and then there's a green parking lot for one of our local partners called Civic Works. And this Growing Green initiative really partners with 2 other big initiatives that we have, the Vacants to Values project that's really being funded by the mayor's office to demolish vacant and blighted buildings over the next 10 years, and also with some of our NGOs, that's Parks and People Foundation, doing around power and dirt, and also helping residents and businesses adopt a lot of the city-owned vacant lots for urban greening and gardening. So Growing Green initiative works with both of these other initiatives, and that's ideally what we're trying to do, is bring together as many of these projects as possible in that whole block approach. We've been working a lot on the tree canopy and working with Tree Baltimore. There are 2 training programs that have been developed, one called Tree Keepers, where we're helping with maintenance by training folks on how to go through and help us plant trees and also maintain trees. And there's a series of classes and courses that they go through, and then a certification process. We're also doing the same thing with invasive species removal, and we've got that one called Weed Warriors, and again, training people on how to properly identify and remove these species. We've also worked with the University of Michigan to create a database of trees that really considered future climate conditions and identify species that do well in the climate conditions we're expected to see over certain periods of time. And that included a real look at maintenance and soil requirements, planting specifications, consideration for different areas of the city, and created a spatial analysis tool where you can look up a property in the city and identify what trees are going to do best there in the next 10 to 50 years. So that's something that we're hoping to share over time with other cities and allow it to be manipulated so that it can work in, somewhere like it's helpful for another city. As part of all of this, we've been working with some other partners to actually, and this includes Johns Hopkins University and the Maryland Institute College of Art, to put together sensors so that we can start to collect data. As we're going through and doing this whole block approach, we wanted to have information about what the heat island was in those areas, or the average heat on a daily basis, versus as we go through and we implement these green initiatives and these energy initiatives, are we seeing a change in the urban heat island? So we have over 200 of these tiny little sensors deployed in our hotspots around the city in the areas that we're starting to implement a lot of these projects. And we'll have them up over the next 5 years, and we're working with Hopkins to collect that data and then identify what's making the biggest impact, and are there certain things that are done together that make a bigger impact over others. So that's been a really great project for us and something we just started doing. We're also focusing a lot on food resiliency. This is something, again, we're doing in partnership with Johns Hopkins to look at our whole system and where our food is coming from. This is a much bigger project than I thought it was going to be when I originally got started on it, but it is in our public services part of our DP3, and it really is looking at the whole food system, where our food is coming from. Something that this actually ties directly to is the most recent incident we had with the riots there was food provided. There was a manager for food to response workers and emergency workers, but it was identified in the Office of Emergency Management that they didn't have anybody identifying where food would go to residents in places that were most impacted. And so we've really been working a lot with the Office of Emergency Management since that time to integrate that sort of planning into the food resiliency plan, so that we're also thinking about emergency food, and our Baltimore Food Policy Initiative group is really involved in that. And as you can tell, we do a lot of partnering with universities. Here we also have Morgan State University, and with a lot of the professors there, last year we developed a year-long curriculum that integrates 6 of their different departments with our work here in the Office of Sustainability to think around whole community resiliency. And so they're actually working in one of our target neighborhoods that has the largest urban heat island impact, and also floodplain, issues with floodplain, to get their students starting to think about whole block approaches and resiliency in the work that they're doing. And what's really great about it is we don't let them get away with just really pretty designs. We actually make them consider the financial pieces as well, and so that's why it brings together so many different parts and departments, and these are projects that we're hoping to have shovel-ready by the end of the semester. And then obviously equity is a huge issue and something we need to prioritize, and we have been prioritizing. We are ensuring that our neighborhoods that have the highest vulnerability to these impacts from climate change are the areas that we're focusing the majority of our efforts. We're doing a lot to provide job training and green job opportunities through a lot of these different initiatives and writing them into all of our different grants. And then really working to also think about economic benefits for people who live in these neighborhoods and thinking about lowering electricity costs, and that's how we're working on a lot of our different systems and bringing them together. I will say that we're considering man-made hazards. That's not the primary portion of what I do or what this plan is about, but we did identify the emergency support functions, and then I also serve on the local emergency planning committee and our threats, hazard identification, risk assessment. I'm there more for the climate piece, but we do a lot of talking about how everything we do to prepare for climate change will make us better prepared for all man-made hazards. And that became clear, again, with the riots that we had most recently, where we were able to access a lot of those community leaders very, very quickly through some of the relationships that we had built up through some of our preparedness work. So that is something that we do consider, although it's not the primary focus of this plan. And that goes a little bit into the communications work and kind of that community outreach and how we've been building those relationships. We started with a preparedness campaign called Make a Plan, Build a Kit, Help Each Other at the beginning of last year. And really when we were talking to people about preparedness and talking to them about the development of this plan, they said, well, what are we supposed to do? How do we help beyond, agreeing to have these initiatives move forward in our neighborhoods? We said, well, you can make a plan, you can build an emergency kit, and then you can start to enhance your own community adaptive capacity by helping each other and identifying your assets and shortcomings now so we can start to take care of them ahead of time. So we had a launch event last April that brought in over 350 people and really connects them with experts to help in developing emergency plans, just two-sided plans that we created, and then also goes through exactly what's in an emergency kit and how to use it. So we're not just handing out an emergency kit and saying, here's your kit. It actually goes through every single piece of what's in the kit and teaches folks how they need to maintain those kits. And then the last piece of help each other is using a lot of maps or communication tools to identify what assets exist in that community, what's working really well for that community, what has worked in the past, and then what shortcomings they've had and different training opportunities that we can do moving forward. And these are just a couple slides that show what we were doing for Make a Plan. We're looking a lot at evacuation routes, shelter locations, hospitals, schools, medical needs. These are the items that we provided for free in the kits, and that was funded from a local foundation called the Town Creek Foundation to really help us with getting these materials out to folks in lower-income neighborhoods. And then we did create something called the Help Safe sign. So a lot of folks here do not have a landline, but we do have some pretty dense communities. and it's a way for us to start getting communities to talk with each other and also with their community emergency response team members. And so we have these signs. One side says help and the other says safe, and we encourage people to keep them in their windows during an event. And if they're in need of assistance, they put the help in their window just in case they don't feel comfortable leaving or they're unable to leave, or they want to let people know that they do need assistance. And our focus for these have really been in public housing. We've also done a lot, like I mentioned, in kind of the row houses and areas that are most vulnerable to heat. But our public housing has really been a big focus of this project and getting people prepared in these places. And we've also been doing a lot of work with kids. So getting kids very, very much engaged as well and trying to make preparedness fun. So we've created a lot of preparedness games. We have memory match games. We have twister games. We have pin the item on the turtle games, which I'll talk about later. And really, like I mentioned, providing the food and free food, but getting them to think about fresh and healthy food. So a lot of opportunities to work with kids. And then Turtle has been one of our most fun communication elements, where we've created a 6.5-foot turtle that kids and adults love equally. The mayor is pictured there on the lower left-hand side. Her and Turtle get along at a lot of our events, but Turtle's our sustainability and resiliency mascot, and we bring Turtle out to a lot of our weather and climate days and just try to make climate preparedness a little bit more fun instead of doom and gloom all the time. So the biggest thing we're moving forward with right now and building upon with the Make a Plan, Build It, Get Help Each Other is moving forward on creating resiliency hubs. And that's really working on the work, or thinking about the work that we're doing on energy and greening and the whole block approach to develop pilot projects that integrate solar into community critical facilities in lower income areas, and they will have battery backup systems. We're working with these to be actually NGO or community owned, so they're not necessarily city owned facilities, and they'll have access to food, water, shelter, clothing, the basic needs, but also we're attempting to use some of the vacant lots around those hubs for food generation and really thinking a little bit more holistically about that approach. So this is something we're in the midst of to get 2 pilots up in this next year. And then lastly, and this will be fairly quick, but we're integrating as much as we can the considerations for climate change and projects and plans. So our capital improvements process, we developed a resiliency checklist for each of our agency directors to have to go through and identify how their project is taking climate change into mind, and how they're thinking they will be able to help us adapt and respond to natural hazards with that project. They do have to consider things like extreme weather, sea level rise, and floodplain, as well as mitigation. So we have a lot of questions in there also around energy efficiency. But it's a small checklist. It was multiple pages at first, and then it got edited by other powers. But it still has the right intention and what we want folks to start thinking about as they're going through the capital improvements process. We've also been doing a lot with outcome-based budgeting. I serve on 2 outcome-based budgeting teams, and also the rainy day kind of financing committee, to make sure that we're constantly considering climate change and what we've been seeing currently and what we're anticipating seeing with all of our different financial obligations. So it obviously requires a lot of city coordination, and we have to have measurable goals and outcomes, but it's a great way to bring climate change into what we're doing with outcome-based budgeting. And then we're building resiliency into all of our new plans and projects. So anything that's come up since we started the DP3, like the Growing Green Initiative, our Energy Initiative, and Vacants to Values, really does consider climate change, brings it into the planning process, and is part of what's integrated, and we identify overlaps between those initiatives and what we're hoping to do with the DP3. Like I mentioned before, we have a ton of different local partners, and I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to kind of go quickly through these. But you know, we do a lot of partnerships regionally with our surrounding counties on these areas, and then also with our other regional partnerships. Like I mentioned, DC and Philadelphia are fairly close. We do a lot with the surrounding counties through the Wilderness Coalition and the Urban Waters Partnership. We also are looking at regional and national groups. So outside of this group, ASAP, we also working with the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, the Association of Floodplain Managers, and the STAR Community Rating System. So these are four main plans that are guiding sustainability and resiliency work. Everything kind of started with our sustainability plan. The Climate Action Plan came next. DP3 really looked at a lot of the methodology from those, and then Homegrown Baltimore was adopted in that same year. And these are what we are using moving forward to guide our work. And that's all from me. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Kristen. That is a lot of information, and it's really inspirational to see how many areas you're moving forward at the same time. I'm not sure how you can manage all of that and how you can come up with such great names for all your different programs to make them resonate with the community, but that's really great. I'm going to ask you one question, and then I'm going to turn it over to the ASAP members and let them ask questions. So if you have a question, you can either type it into the question box and I can read it out to Kristen, or you can raise your hand and I will unmute you and we can see if we can hear you directly and you can ask your question directly. But my question comes back to, at the beginning you talked about, you showed this graphic of the 40-person advisory committee from all these different organizations, and we know that preparing for the impacts of climate change really is multi-sectoral and multi-jurisdictional, and you need to bring all these pieces together. But were there any secrets to managing those interactions with those 40 people to get such a successful plan out there?
Well, I think there were tricks to getting them, first of all, to agree to be part of the committee and then having them be engaged through. The trick to getting them to be part of the advisory committee plan, and the fact that that's a requirement in order for us to have access to the pre-disaster mitigation funds. Once we made that clear to the mayor's office that that was heavily connected with funding opportunities and a requirement at the federal level for us to be part of all these, the NFIP, the mayor's office is actually who we had sent out the invitations to be part of the advisory committee, at least to the directors of each of the departments. So it wasn't coming from me. It wasn't coming from the director of the Office of Sustainability. It was actually coming directly from the mayor's office, and that was incredibly helpful in making it a high priority, at least in the first few meetings. And then once people started to understand what it was about and got very much engaged, then they were willing to show up. And I think a trick for keeping them engaged is we didn't send them home or I guess back to their offices with a lot of homework. Instead, we offered to do the assessment where we looked at their projects and plans and identified the overlaps for them. And I think, that obviously takes a lot of staff time and energy. It's helpful if you're the project manager because you get to know all the other plans and projects that are going on and you can help identify those overlaps. But that was a key to not give them a bunch of extra work to do, but really to make the meetings that we had incredibly efficient and worthwhile of their time and asking them about their areas of expertise.
Great. No, that makes a lot of sense. I have a question from Susie Moser. She said, and a comment, she said, fantastic work, Kristen. Really proud that ASAP is highlighting your work and that you've obviously accomplished a lot, but likely there's obviously a lot of underlying capacity, human capital, mindsets, and training that enables you to do so much, and probably all kinds of other important factors that allow you to succeed. If you were pressed to point to 3 things, what would you say are the most important, quote, ingredients to your secret sauce to make all of this work?
I think taking the time that we did to engage all the different stakeholders and all the members of the community that we did as part of the planning process, and really trying to tailor our conversation or what we were doing to them specifically. So we changed up the way that we presented on this or had dialogue around the process to all of our different audiences. We changed it up a lot and changed the language a lot when we were dealing with members of the community that maybe had never heard of climate change ever in their life versus folks we were talking with at local institutions or at the port who were already considering this and thinking about disaster risk reduction. So I think that having all of those different folks engaged early on and having them take ownership of not just the plan, but also the implementation of the plan was a key ingredient for us in being able to move directly from adoption of the plan into implementation. Because it helps, well, that was a big piece. I think also doing the crosswalk where we identified the overlaps with the existing projects and plans and kind of what we had done with the capital improvements process, that really helps us not come in and say, here's a new plan, we think you should implement it. It says, here is a plan that already helps get done something that you have as a priority, that you already have funding for, and here's how we just enhance it a little bit to be considering these elements around climate change. So I think doing that crosswalk and then helping them identify the overlap so they didn't have extra work, but that it was very, very easy for them to say, oh yeah, we could do that, and we could probably do it pretty easily, and that will meet the goals of both of these plans. So that was also a really key ingredient. I think that helped us a lot. I mean, lastly, it's really being, I think, getting really good people to help with implementation, getting people excited about it, and being able to coordinate all your stakeholders. It's a tremendous task to keep implementation up, especially with a lot of other demands and things that are immediate needs. And so it's kind of constantly managing the process and reminding people and following up and kind of being a nag and getting involved in all of their committees and things like that so that everybody's always got climate change on their mind. And I think that's a big piece for us with being involved in the local emergency planning committee, the regional committees, the different partnership groups, the commissions, what we're doing with the finance department, all that other stuff. It really brings climate change up over and over and over and over so that nobody can forget about it and make sure it's not a priority.
Great. Susie said thanks to that.
There's other things.
Well, yeah, you don't have to touch on everyone in our webinar. If anybody else has questions or comments, please raise your hand or type them into the question box. That last thing you said really raises for me something that you mentioned earlier about how important the relationships are and building like those social connections for not only moving forward with implementation, but also being able to respond to disasters. And you said that came up in dealing with the riots, but are there other situations where that's been useful? Have you really seen a difference from when you started to where you are now as far as the interconnection between people?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Not just the riots. I think that's just an easy one for me to point to because it was a very recent and big thing that kind of made national news. But
right.
We've had a lot of smaller and concentrated flooding events here recently that have impacted some of our small businesses, and in some areas over and over and over. They're some of our higher priority areas, our office has developed some very strong relationships with those small business owners and with community members around those small businesses so that we have been able to mobilize ahead of time, work on getting floodgates up, warning them when we know an event is coming, working with them through an event, and then if there is the need to assist with response afterwards and getting them set up with the right resources, we've been able to assist with that. And so we have much stronger relationships with a lot of those small business members and also with local community members that are assisting actually with small business hit more by some of these massive flooding events. We also found that a lot of people have been writing us saying that they've used their kits, which has been kind of fun, where they were like, oh yeah, I used my kit. My power went out for 2 days. We weren't expecting it, and we used this, or we used our flashlight, or we used our water bladder or something. And so we've had a lot of people telling us that they've been using their kits, and especially using their kit really great. And so we're trying to think of ways to build up a stronger connection with some of the local school programming that we're doing to work more on integrating preparedness there. But I think those are some of the cool things that we've had come out of this, is actually people just out of the blue coming back to us and saying, oh, we've used this, it's been great, or thank you so much for the assistance, and that's where the stronger relationships have been great.
One more question, and then I'm going to wrap up this portion and we'll transition into the innovation room. This one's from Christian. It says, great presentation, Kristen. Certainly inspiring to see what Baltimore is doing with climate and resilience planning. As you mentioned, engaging all of the relevant stakeholders is quite a challenge. Were there any roadblocks to obtaining buy-in from different groups to be part of all of these efforts and plans?
I mean, I'll be honest with you, not every group and not every department be as involved as some others. We have some really, really strong partnerships with city agencies and not as strong with others. And some of that comes from what's mandated for them at the state and federal level, or if they have to be considering climate change. And so I think, you know, and I've mentioned this on a couple presentations before, but you know, we have a really hard time with the Department of Transportation, both at the local and state level, of getting them to work with us on infrastructure upgrades that consider climate change rather than just doing the emergency patching or the, you know, the quick fix. So we're working on trying to make that a better partnership and you know, think of different strategies. But I can say that that's been a difficult group for us. You know, I think we're thankfully in an area where we've, at least throughout this process, had a lot of people who didn't necessarily question whether climate change existed, but more so we're really good about pointing to most recent events and saying, well, something's got to be happening because this stuff is crazy here in Baltimore. You know, we've had a earthquake, a derecho, a heat wave, a hurricane, a tornado in the Inner Harbor, like all in the last 4 years. Like, this stuff's crazy. And so we're able to kind of point to a lot of those recent events and get a lot of buy-in and engagement that way. And we do have some stronger partners just because of that connection to the pre-disaster mitigation funding. Public Works gets a lot of funding from the and pre-disaster mitigation funds, so they've been a really great partner. And I think when you have agencies that are going to get access to funding or support for some of their projects from a plan or a process, we get a lot more engagement from the Office of Emergency Management, Department of Public Works, a lot of our NGO partners, where they've had either access to better data, better support, or funding as part of this project.
Great. Well, I'm just going to wrap up this phase of our discussion, and we're not quite out of time, so please stay with us for the intro to the innovation room, and there are another couple questions came in, and maybe we can talk about them during that discussion. I do just want to highlight the next ASAP webinar that's coming up in a couple of weeks. It's a sneak peek at the new ASAP portal on the Georgetown Climate Center's Adaptation Clearinghouse, so register for that and join us there. And then I just want to say thank you to all the ASAP members who participated, as well as to Kristen. Thank you very much for sharing your insights and knowledge and kind of some of the behind-the-scenes look at what it took to get where you are this moment and what all the many, many things that you're continuing to do. So thank you very much.
You bet. Thank you for all the support at ASAP. We appreciate it.
No problem. It's a good collaboration, and the more that ASAP can do to share the promising practices that are being developed in places like Baltimore across the country, I think the better and more resilient the nation's going to be as a whole. So thanks.